Hello and welcome to Inforendum Part 2b. This is taking a little longer look at what was likely to happen to the economy over the next 50 years, again comparing an independent Scotland to the UK. If you want to see kind of a more summarised, briefer version of the conclusions of all this, then have a look at our video Part 2, which is also available on the site. The problem that comes up in this long-term analysis is all to do with debt. So let's assume that in year one the government has to borrow some money as shown in the chart here. The reason it has to borrow money is because it has to spend more on public services than it's able to bring in revenues from all of the taxes in the economy. So at the end of year one, the amount of debt that has been borrowed goes into a pot we'll call the total debt, and the government then has to go out and borrow another pot of money to pay for the services in year two. At the end of year two, the same thing happens, but now the total amount of debt has doubled unless the government has been able to pay some of it back in the intervening time. The same thing happens in year three and so on, and eventually you build up a level of debt in the economy that needs to be managed. Now, economists pay a lot of attention to this, and one of the things we've seen in the report is a graph like this, where the total amount of debt that is accumulated in the economy can be shown in a graph over time. If you have a picture like this, then that's what's called a sustainable situation, because the total amount of debt isn't increasing, typically because you're paying off some of it each year as you go. The problem comes when you have a graph like this, where the total amount of debt just keeps rising and rising indefinitely, and that leads to major problems, as we'll see in the next slide. So why is this whole business of sustainability important? Well, we can think of some fairly recent examples, Greece being a key one, where it didn't have a sustainable economy. So on the left hand side here, this is the graph that shows how the country's debt in Greece just accumulated over the period from the 70s right up to just a couple of years ago. That's the blue line there, and you can see it actually reached a level of about 190% or so of the size of its economy. So it was actually borrowing twice as much as it was actually producing in its entire economy. And if you compare that to the green line, which is the average of all the other Eurozone countries, you can see how Greece really was out of line. So that's just an example of what happens in general terms. If you look at the points on the right hand side here, what happens is that if the debt grows and grows, eventually it gets to be bigger than 100% of the actual economy of the whole country. When that happens, it starts to look risky to investors. So in order to attract investors, you've got to offer them higher and higher interest rates. Downside of that, of course, is you've got to pay that interest rate out of the money you raise. So a bigger and bigger proportion of your total spending goes out on paying the interest. Borrowers start to get concerned that the country is never going to be able to repay its debt. Basically, it gets a very poor credit rating, just like we as individuals, if we have too much debt, end up with a very poor credit rating, and you become unable to borrow new money. And when a country gets in that situation, the country can't really fund its public services, and what that means in practice is they can't pay the pensions, they can't pay the public sector workers, they can't invest in health and all the other things they need to do. And in the case of Greece, you can see how it gets to a point where you reach an utter crisis, where they had to have a bailout and they were having riots on the street, etc. So this whole business of having a sustainable economy where the debt doesn't keep on growing indefinitely is really an important factor that economists look at. So to jump right to kind of one of the key conclusions, this is what they predict for the growth in the public sector debt over the next 50 years between Scotland and the UK. Now this starts to get a little bit complicated, so let me just explain it. On the left, you see the axis there is a percentage which showing the total debt expressed as a percent of the national income, which is basically the total size of the economy. And the bottom axis is obviously time, showing where we start going out 50 years. And as you can see from the shape of this graph, the solid line, which is the UK, isn't great. However, it does have well, let me put it this way, it has a flatter line than Scotland, and the fact that the line for independent Scotland is just rising indefinitely is indicating that unless something different is done, then Scotland is going to get into one of these unsustainable situations where the level of debt just continues to rise. Now, that's not a disaster, meaning that you should or shouldn't vote yes or no. It means that the economics are predicting there are things that would need to be dealt with, and we'll come on later to what are those things and how might they be dealt with. But this is the prediction for what they call their baseline assumptions about all the various. One of the nice things about the analysis is it does a kind of a best case and worst case situation by varying various types of factors around the baseline, which is the graph that we just looked at. So in the case of Scotland, how does the best case come about? Well, here are the things that were varied. First of all, to get the best case, you would assume the highest inward migration into Scotland. So net immigration going up from its current level of about 10,000 a year historically up to 24,000 per year. Secondly, higher productivity, and the authors of the report assume that all of the North Sea activity which is declining would be replaced, and that the onshore productivity would increase. Thirdly, that the rate of decline of North Sea revenues would be the slowest possible, and that follows the figures that the Scottish Government prefer to use, and also keeping oil at a high price. The best case would also be to have a lower share of the existing debt to begin with, so Scotland takes less than its per person share of the existing UK debt at independence. And also the interest rates that Scotland would pay when it borrowed money would be at a low rate, in fact the same as the UK, which has a long history of borrowing money and has a much larger economy. If you put all those things in together, you then get this picture. It's the same two lines as before, but now there's a third line on there, which is the best case. When you take all those things that could go as well as they possibly could, then that's probably the best that Scotland's going to do in 50 years' time. And what you see there is you still have this picture where the amount of debt is got this kind of upward trend that's undesirable. Not certainly to the same level, but it's still getting up to over the 100% of the size of the economy, so it is a cause for concern. Now, here are the conclusions of the report to remind you. First of all, just as the UK as a whole faces serious fiscal choices over the medium and longer term, the report says it's clear that an independent Scotland would face even tougher choices, and the way they measure that, the analysis shows in the long run Scotland's fiscal gap, which is the measure of this economic problem, is between 2 times and 7 times worse than the UK as a whole. Now the reason for that is due almost entirely to one thing, which is to do with the demographics of the Scottish population in terms of the way the population is made up over the different age groups, which we can look at here. So on this graph here we've got the Scottish and UK populations forecast and how they will change over the next 50 years between 2012 and 2062. The dark blue figures relate to Scotland and the light blue figures relate to the rest of the UK. And the population makeup is divided into age groups. So for example, in the 16 to 25 age group, it's saying over the 50 years, this age group will reduce by 13.9% in Scotland, but in the UK it will increase by 5.1%. So that's the way the graph works. So if you look at this, one of the things that becomes apparent is that the age groups of the working population between 16 and 65, for Scotland every single one of those groups is showing a reduction, whereas for the UK as a whole those groups are increasing. The over 65 age group in Scotland, in fact, is the only one which is increasing. So this is what causes the potential problem for the Scottish economy, because with a smaller working age population, there are fewer people to drive the economy in terms of producing the output, doing all the jobs and services that make the goods, paying all the taxes, etc. And a larger population of older people typically have higher costs in terms of pensions and healthcare. So overall the economy is bringing in less and having to spend more when you have a population that's made up like this. And you see the reason that it's particularly severe for Scotland is really because there is no growth in any of these areas here, whereas for the UK as a whole it does achieve a more balanced picture over the 50-year period. Another factor is that the total size of the population growth is much less for Scotland. Scotland is forecast to grow by only 4%, whereas the UK will grow by 22%. The fact that an independent Scotland has got a more difficult economic challenge than the rest of the UK is one of the few things in this referendum that both sides do agree on. Key question is what to do about it. Now, the Scottish Government have published their economic plan to deal with this challenging long-term outlook. So if you would like to see the contents of that plan and what they would propose to do about it, please see our video Inforendum Part 2C.